And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. And Book TV is in London, interviewing some authors. And joining us now is Professor A.C. Grayling, the author of more than 30 books. His most recent is called The God Argument. Professor Grayling, in that book, you write, "The burdens of religion are both social and political." What do you mean by that?
Well, we need only look really across the landscape of history to see how divisive, how many conflicts, how many difficulties are created by divisions among people of religious outlook. The burden there is not just an historical one, it's also contemporary. When we look across, for example, the Middle East and South Asia, we see these difficulties too, and they happen in our own societies. And so there is a great burden. And one thing that I wanted to argue for in that book was a different way of thinking about the ethical, which is to say, all those questions we ask ourselves about how we're to relate to one another, what our responsibilities are, how we should choose lives that are good and flourishing, so that they don't cause those divisions.
Well, Professor, hasn't religion helped to define what good and moral is?
People say this. The young religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and I say young because, of course, we look back across 2,500, 3,000 years perhaps, but they are young. They've changed the way that people relate to the world and to one another quite dramatically. If you look at the ethical systems that they embody, all the very best of them, the adjurations to care for the widows and the orphans, to treat our fellow human beings as if they were our brothers and sisters, are common to all the great ethical outlooks, including the secular, the non-religious ones. And insofar as they have anything particular or special to them, they do tend to generate disagreements with the other ethical outlooks. And so that's, I think, where some of the problem arises.
Back to the God argument. Like magic and astrology, you write, religion dates from mankind's less educated and knowledgeable early history and has been superseded by advances in our understanding of the world and ourselves.
I think that's really obvious in a way from when one looks at what animism is, and this is a term that applies to the sort of pre-revealed religions of the world, and which were probably the dominant outlook for many, many tens of thousands of years before our own historical period. And what you see there is an attempt by human beings to give some explanation, to provide some conceptual framework, really, for thinking about the world. The one thing that they understood was agency. They understood their own capacity to pick up a stone and throw it, or to pour water, or to make a noise. And so they thought that everything that happened in nature must have an agency behind it, that the wind, the thunder, the rain must be caused by something rather similar to themselves. And that is a kind of proto-science, and it's an attempt to provide this explanatory framework of ideas. And if you look at how ideas about religion have changed over the millennia, you notice that whereas the dryads and the nymphs and the sea gods and the rain gods were present in nature, bit by bit they moved away as we understood more about nature. They went to the mountaintops, for example, Olympus and elsewhere. In the Old Testament we have a burning bush on the mountaintop and a pillar of smoke by day, which sounds like a volcano god. And then the gods went off into the sky, Ra, and the Egyptians saw their god every day burning in the sky, the sun. But now, of course, the gods are beyond space and time altogether, and this, I think, marks something of the horizon of the advance of knowledge.
Haven't we been through these cycles before in our history, though, where we think science will supersede religion and other things?
Well, I don't think science is ever going to supersede our ethical, our literary, our humanistic interests, and it doesn't claim to do so. If you talk to somebody working in one of the advanced areas of science, particle physics or biology, they are concerned with a particular range of natural phenomena and the attempt to understand them. The things that we really value in our lives, our affections and our connectedness with one another, all the social and political questions which are of very great importance in organising and running society, these are not matters that an empirical scientist can do more than contribute to, can give us help with understanding and with facts. But we, all of us, have to be reflective, and we all have to be part of the great conversation of mankind, where we come to some decisions and compromises about how we live together.
Professor Grayling, in the God argument, you argue for humanism. What is humanism?
Humanism is an attitude rather than a doctrine. It's an attitude that says if we're to think most fruitfully about our human relationships, our social and individual relationships, we've got to start from our most generous and sympathetic understanding of human nature and the human condition. Now, the human condition, of course, is something which is richly explored by literature and history and philosophy. Understanding human nature is much more difficult, because it is so various and complex. And indeed, it's a lifetime's work to try to understand oneself, let alone other people, given all the diversity of others from oneself. But that is where we have to start in order to be able to work with the grain of human nature and to try to be tolerant, to give other people the margin of possibility for themselves to find lives that feel good to them. I mean, one very key thing here is this, that for most of history, most people, and alas still today, have been told that there is one right way to live, one great truth, one answer to the question of what it all means. And what the Enlightenment of the 18th century reminded us, actually, from classical antiquity is that there is a great diversity in human talent for good lives. There's a great diversity among human beings. I'm often put in mind of what George Bernard Shaw said when he was meditating on the golden rule, which says, do to others as you would have them do to you. And he said, under no circumstances should you do to others what you'd like them to do to you, because they may not like it. And this is a very deep point. It's a deep point because it asks us to treat others in their individuality and particularity. And to do that, one has to have some insight into human nature, the best we can get into this very, very complex matter. And that's why the demand is on us to be thoughtful, to be observant, to be educated. I mean, in the sense that we become truly reflective about the great range of human possibilities. And that is the basis of a humanistic view in ethics, because it starts from the human, at the human scale, looking for the things in human life that tend to flourishing.
Are humans innately moral?
I think they are. We are intrinsically social animals, essentially social animals. We need one another. We need to give and receive affection. If you look at our newspapers, they're full of atrocity and tragedy and conflict and war. But that's because those things are news. I mean, in every town, city, village of the world, every single day of the year, there are millions of acts of courtesy, kindness, common friendship, people just getting on. The fact that the buses run and the electricity comes on mainly in most advanced economies is because people are doing what they said they would do. That's the majority story. So we are, I think, fundamentally well disposed towards one another. And if you wanted an illustration of why one would think that, suppose you were walking down the street and you saw somebody ahead of you onto whom a great pile of bricks was about to fall, unbeknownst to her. What would you do? You wouldn't say, this is going to be interesting. You'd say, look out. You'd cry out to them. And it wouldn't matter who they are, what their ethnicity, what their religion, what their political views, just another human being, and your instinct would be to help them.
Back to your book, The God Argument. Freedom from coercive ideology is both a human right and a fundamental civil liberty.
There's no question of it. And I think about the major religions of the world and the major political ideologies of the Stalinist and Nazi kind. They share one thing in common. That is, they have a view that they know how things ought to be organized, and everybody's got to sign up for it. This is the one thing they have in common, this structure of ideology, which forces onto people a particular view and a particular practice. And I think anybody would agree that your right to freedom, freedom of expression, to self-determination, to privacy, these are things that you would want to defend very robustly against, let us say, a totalitarian regime like the Stalinist. But insofar as the Stalinist regime shares with a major religious outlook, like the Catholic Church of Torquemada during the Inquisition, or like the Calvinists of Geneva at the time of Calvin himself, you would see that exactly the same thing applies. Freedom from that kind of coercion over thought and practice is a fundamental human right. And so one thing I argue in the book is that we should refocus our thinking a bit about this. Of course, people can choose to believe what they like, and of course religious movements and churches have every right to exist and put their point of view, but no right to coerce people into sharing their point of view. And alas, most of history and too much of the world today is still under the government of coercion in that respect.
This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we are in London, and we're talking with various authors while we're here. Today joining us is Professor Anthony Grayling. The God Argument is his most recent book. Professor, while we're taping this interview, a new pope is being chosen. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, to me personally, it's an irrelevance. It's a little bit of theatre. It has a comic aspect to it, but it also has a serious aspect, which is, of course, that there are many hundreds of millions of people who regard themselves as being Roman Catholics, who will therefore be influenced by the sorts of policies that the new pope comes up with. Are priests going to be able to marry? Will there be a change of view about contraception? Will the moral teaching of the Church become more liberal, or will it remain rather authoritarian? And these are matters that impact on people's lives. Principally, by the way, since the great majority of members of the Roman Catholic Church use contraception, let us say, they are at odds with the official teaching of their Church, and unfortunately obliged, in the interests of their own children, in the interests of their own lives, to embrace hypocrisy, which is what ultimately it comes down to. That's a hard word, but alas, it's true. And I think people would like to live with consistency, be able to feel that they live with some degree of integrity in their lives. But the way that these very ancient doctrines apply to modern lives does cause a great deal of distortion, and that's one example.
With regard to humanism, you talk about different legislation that can happen, such as drug legalization. Why is that a humanistic approach?
Well, the indirect route to a view about what kind of public policy might be based on humanistic ethics must always take into account the fact that what we're trying to do is to work with the grain of human nature. People who want to take drugs, who need to take drugs, and personally, by the way, I should mention that out of sheer timidity, I've never myself taken them. This is because what passes for my brain is my instrument. It's a bit like bashing your violin if you're a musician, so I don't myself do it. But I do think it ought to be decriminalised, because the people who want to do it are going to do it anyway. And what happens if you criminalise such activities is demonstrated eloquently by what happened in the United States in the 1920s with Prohibition. You create a massive criminal industry, you criminalise ordinary people because they're doing something they want to do, feel they need to do, and you cause more problems, more burden on the police, on the courts, than is necessary. I think what one wants to do is to argue with people about it and say this is a very silly way of doing things. The world and humanity are so extraordinary, so beautiful, so fascinating, that you can be on a high 24 hours a day just by finding stuff out and reading and talking to other people. And you don't need these chemicals to do it. And if you could dissuade them from taking the chemical route, all the better. But to criminalise them for doing it seems to be, well, it's like King Canute trying to stop the tide from coming in.
Sexual services.
Well, there too, I mean, I think, again, criminalisation causes problems. It drives it underground, it puts it into the hand of criminals. People, men and women, who go into sex work are less likely to be protected or helped out of that if they want to be helped out of it. But also, again, it's a matter of individual liberty, like the drugs thing, like taking alcohol, like smoking cigarettes. All these things, you might have one or another attitude towards them. But the idea that we know better than you, that we don't like it so you mustn't do it, that my morality that I've chosen, I'm going to force onto you, this is the source of a great deal of trouble and indeed of suffering in the world. And what we have to do is we have to step back, extend the hand of help to anybody who needs our help, to do it in a kind, humane kind of way, but also recognise that people must be allowed their choices, must be allowed their freedoms.
Professor Grayling, do you consider yourself a libertarian then?
No, I distinguish between somebody who, in the European sense of the word liberal, I know that the word liberal is a term of malediction in the United States because of its political connotations. But here, with a small l, a liberal is somebody who believes that we must be open in the way that John Stuart Mill, in his wonderful essay on liberty, argued, that there must be many experiments in human life. We must allow people to find their own way, consonant with their own talents for good and flourishing and happy lives, to seek those lives. I think a libertarian, that's a much stronger notion, that one. That one says anything goes. It says it's okay to trample on the heads of other people if you can make a profit out of it. And I think that attitude is wrong. We do need to get together and talk a bit about how we're going to regulate things so that we can protect the weak, so that we can promote things that we feel are good, that there is a space in the public forum for debates about things like drug policy and prostitution and education. I mean, all the different things that really impact on our lives. But I don't think anything goes. It's a parallel, to having an open mind. They say, don't have such an open mind that your brains fall out. Well, the same thing is, be open, be liberal in your attitudes, but not to the extent that you just give license to people to do anything they like.
Well, one of the policy debates we're having currently in the States is on gun policy. How does that fit into your philosophy?
Yes, I'm very well aware of that debate, and of course the Europeans look with open-mouthed wonder at the fact that there is such an acerbic discussion about this thing. Of course, there is gun crime in Europe as well. We've seen some horrible examples of that recently, but far, far fewer such incidents. And it does seem that at very, very least, assault weapons and automatic weapons and allowing people to have multiple armaments, in their homes is a recipe for disaster. And the repeated tragedies of shootings at colleges in the United States, it really does astonish people outside. That there should be such a fetishization, really, of the constitutional right, although it's ambiguous. Is it about militias in times of danger, or is it about individuals being able to have 15 automatic rifles in their homes? It is a puzzle to us outside, and I rather hope that what your Vice President is doing at the moment might have some success.
Well, Professor Grayling, to take it to your drug legalization argument, wouldn't allowing assault weapons be like allowing heroin? I mean, are they comparable?
No. If people were entitled to own and possess guns that they only ever fired at themselves, then that would be parallel to the heroin case.
Professor A.C. Grayling is our guest. He is the author of The God Argument, among other books. What is your background?
Well, I was born of British parents out in the fading remnants of empire in Central Africa, where my father was working out there. And that was in some ways quite formative in that we were living in a rather remote part of Central Africa where there was no television and where the BBC radio service that we were able occasionally to get was very crackly. And so, of course, being English, we like to listen to the cricket matches on the radio. But for adults, I've always imagined that the only resource was whiskey and adultery. But for children there, we were rather thrown on our literary resources. So reading was a major thing for us, and I think that must have been rather influential because my tastes have always been in that direction. And very early on, I came across references to Socrates and to Aristotle and to the great thinkers of the past, and at quite an early age came across a collection of Plato's dialogues, in fact at the age of 12. And this was because, by the way, a lot of Brits would go out to the empire and promptly die of some tropical disease, leaving the books that they'd been using at university to the local library. And so there was a collection of the Jowett translations of Plato. And I took down the first volume and read one of the early dialogues of Plato. It was very accessible, called the Charmides. And it was about continence, about Socrates talking to this youth about what he thought he meant by restraint and self-government. And it sparked this sense that surely is the way to live with a passion for the philosophical debates. And the good news is that if you do get interested in philosophy, it's a kind of license to stick your nose into everything, which I've been doing ever since.
We're calling you professor. Where have you taught?
I taught at Oxford University and at London University, and just recently I'm the founder of a new college for the study of the humanities here in London, where I continue to teach philosophy.
Talk to us about the college, the new college.
Well, our education system in England in particular, not in the United Kingdom in general, because Scotland has a slightly different system, but our system here makes people specialists very, very early, very quickly. After the age of 16, our school children, our high school children, take fewer and fewer subjects and end up at university studying one subject usually. And this seems to me to be a mistake for our century, where more and more people go to university, but they need a much broader horizon of view. And so what I wanted to do was to marry the liberal arts tradition, which flourishes in the United States, with our own sort of Oxford tutorial tradition, which is the one-to-one, very intensive, very in-depth examination of a particular subject. So you get the in-depth aspect, you get the breadth aspect, and in order to marry them, you have to ask the students to do much more than they normally do in an undergraduate curriculum. Of course, undergraduates must party, and therefore they must lie in bed from time to time, but there's plenty of slack in the week for to ask them to do more. And so our college is quite intensive, and we ask our students to do a broad range of things alongside their in-depth scholarly study. And it turns out that they love it. I mean, they see the connections, they see how these different fields of inquiry feed into one another.
It's a private university, correct?
It's an independent university. All universities in the United Kingdom are private in the sense that they're not publicly owned, but most of them get public subsidy. Some, like Oxford and Cambridge, about 25% of their income is public money. But so we're independent, and one of the very few here in the United Kingdom. But this is a model which is having to change because of the way higher education is funded in the United Kingdom. So another aspect of what the United States has taught us about higher education is that a very good model is the endowment model. I'm told that Harvard University has something like $30 billion in its endowment, and I say to people, when my endowment is that big, you can all come for free forever.
Professor Grayling, in your 2011 book, The Good Book, what is that, and what was your discussion with the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Well, first I should mention that in addition to writing rather academic textbooks and monographs in philosophy, I've also written quite a lot for a more general readership, not with the ambition of telling people what to think, but to alert them to the fact that there is a very rich resource for thinking about the nature of the good life. And by that, by the way, I don't mean a sort of conventional kind of moral life. I mean one which really feels good to live and is full of flourishing and progress towards the achievement of worthwhile goals that people specify for themselves. Always, of course, under government of being able to make a case and to defend against criticism. So the writing that I did in that respect was prompted by the fact that many years ago, more than 30 years ago, while I was thinking a bit about different ethical systems when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I thought to myself, once I read my way through the Bible of religion, I thought, if only somebody or some group of people, instead of going to all these texts and collating them and editing them and weaving them together as they did to make the Old and New Testaments, if only they'd gone to the non-religious literature of the world, to the philosophers and the poets and the historians, the essayists, the epistle writers, like Seneca and Pliny and Cicero and Aristotle and others, if only they'd gone to them and taken texts from them, woven them together, they would find that they would have a book comparable to this, full of rich insight and inspiration, full of commentary on the human condition, which would have been an even better resource because it would have been less divisive and less minatory in the sense that of telling people what to do, but giving people the materials to think for themselves. And of course, the minute I thought that, I thought perhaps I should try and do it. So about 30-odd years ago, I started to collect the materials, and I did to them exactly what the Bible makers did. And I redacted them, chose sections of them, I stitched them together in different ways, and I came up with an overall text, which I divided into books. So there is a book of Genesis which begins with the apple falling in Newton's garden, so I needed to have a garden to begin with, and which goes through consolations and parables and songs and so on, but paralleling the Bible of religion. But there is not one mention of religion, not one mention of the word God or goddess or faith or religion, heaven, nothing like that. It's entirely secular, but to illustrate the fact that had this been done, we would have had a resource of a very different kind, because there is a huge amount of comfort and of wisdom in the literatures of the world. And I drew from Chinese and Indian, and I mean from all the resources. In some cases I had the great pleasure really of rewriting and translating and I didn't give any references. Nobody will know where these texts come from, because we don't know where the original texts of the Bible of religion come from. So I'm, rather hubristically try to construct something that would stand alongside or on the same shelf to show that it can be done, and to show that from the human heart there has been a huge amount that we can profit from.
And you had a discussion on your good book and the Bible with the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes, indeed, with Rowan Williams. Some years before, he had invited me to have a discussion, a sort of double-header with him before an audience about a book he'd written on Dostoevsky's Ethics, which is an interest of mine as well. Now, Dostoevsky, of course, was a very committed Christian, and in his writings, in particular, Notes from Underground and The Crime and Punishment and The Idiot, he had tried to explore the idea of good and evil. And Rowan Williams is a fine scholar, and he'd discussed these ideas and wanted a secularist or non-religious response to them. So he owed me. And so when the good book came out, I asked him to come and debate it with me. And we had a very, very civil debate. And it was only right at the very end of a long discussion about ethics where we agreed about practically everything, that the word God appeared. And that was sort of in a joke at the end. But it just shows you that people of goodwill and good intention actually share a great deal. And the divisions only come in when people find that there are, these commitments of faith that separate us.
So has the Church of England been good for the UK?
Well, here's a great philosophical answer for you. Yes and no. I mean, obviously, there are aspects of any kind of organised outlook on life, which, for example, promotes charities or educational endeavours, must have a good aspect to it, yes. But I think the effect of religion in far too many societies for far too much of history has been deeply negative. Just recently, for example, I was busy reviewing a book in which the argument was put that what 19th century American critics of religion said, namely, that if we were still as religious as we were in the past, we would still be believing that the earth is flat. And his response to this was to say it's not true, because, of course, Aristotle and others knew that the planet is a sphere. But I had to respond to him by saying, look, in 1615, Cardinal Bellarmine, who went on to become a pope, wrote a letter to a monk who had tried to find a defense of the Copernican view of the universe that the church could live with. And Bellarmine wrote to him and said, you've got to realize that this endeavor must fail, because it is written in the scriptures that God has laid the foundations of the earth so that the earth will never be moved, that the earth doesn't go around the sun. This is a matter of doctrine. And this is an example which looks like an historical example, of course, but it has its echoes in the great debate about evolutionary biology and creationism or intelligent design in the United States today. And people fail to recognize, perhaps, that Islam is a committed creationist religion and opposes evolutionary biology likewise. Now, evolutionary biology is at the foundations of some of the most significant developments in biochemistry and in medicine, medical research, stem cell research, for example, and in improvements in the quality of life for people. So that when you have policies like the one that George W. Bush ran, that there were going to be no new lines of stem cells for research, that it had to be limited to the ones that already existed. This is doctrine, this is religious doctrine, getting in the way of very important scientific advance which could benefit humanity. And it's that kind of thing where all the churches, and Church of England is a very Laodicean church, but religion in general can stand in the way of serious progress.
How has religion changed in the UK in the last 100 years?
Well, if you were able to resurrect a medieval monk and put him down into a church service in one of today's Church of England churches, he wouldn't recognise the Christianity he meets there. You were mentioning that you'd been in Munich. Had you been to the Alte Pinakothek in Munich with one of the world's greatest collections of altarpieces and murals, you would have seen that the visual literature of the medieval mind, where most people were illiterate, was powerfully coercive and violent. I mean, these scenes of punishment in hell, of the sufferings of Christ, of the picture of the universe given to people in medieval times, is very, very different from the average church service now, where we all shake hands and the kiss of peace is passed around. Mention of hell is now no longer all that often heard, unless you're in a very Protestant mega church somewhere, perhaps in the southern states of the United States. So the picture has changed dramatically, because the religions are wonderful illustrations of Darwinian evolution. They evolve all the time in response to criticism and hostility from the surrounding society. They adapt. One of the few churches that hasn't adapted enough is the Roman Catholic Church, of course, which sticks to its traditional views. It doesn't go with the ordination of women. Its views about termination of pregnancy and is always what it was. Their opposition to stem cell research, for example. In a number of different ways, they continue to be obstructive of progress. And it is said, the bow that will not bend will break.
Professor Grayling, are most people in England today atheists?
I would have thought that the vast majority of people are secularists, in the sense that they don't want to be run by bishops or mullahs. I should think that most people identify culturally. If they're asked, what are you culturally, they would say, well, of course, they come from a Christian tradition rather than let us say, a Muslim tradition or a Jewish tradition. But I think that even among the officers of the Church of England, there is a great deal of atheism.
Among the officers?
Oh, yes, yes.
Why do you say that?
Well, it's very hard to... I mean, I know for a fact, I know some dog collar wearers who don't subscribe to the actual beliefs. They regard them as symbolic, or as having some kind of poetic or aesthetic or exhortatory value to them, but they don't believe that they're literally true. It's quite hard to imagine how anybody who uses a laptop, flies in an aeroplane, can actually believe in the physical resurrection of Christ or the virgin birth.
Why?
Well, because they're just so profoundly inconsistent with everything else that we know about how the world works. And so they tend to regard them as being symbolic. I mean, for example, a number of theologians in the Church of England now argue that the significance of the doctrine of the resurrection is the idea of being reborn to oneself, a resurrection of the individual. And so this is a kind of metaphor for it. Of course, in Christianity in general, I suppose the key doctrine is the resurrection. If it didn't happen, or it's very unlikely, then there's no story there. So it's a difficult one. And when you look at the treatises of theologians, they tend to bury their doubts and anxieties about the literal truth of these things in amongst lots of very long words.
So, given what you've just said about some officials in the Church of England, does that mean that there is a lack of faith in a higher power?
Well, you do get what could, without too much unfairness, be called the feng shui tendency among people who've given up traditional or orthodox religion. The idea that there is some kind of something in the universe, which is very probably on good sort of Jungian grounds, explicable on the basis of the fact that when we were children and the world was a much kinder and better place. Everybody says that things were better in the past. And of course they were for each of us individually, because we didn't pay taxes when we were 4 and 5, so the world was better. And it was also full of higher powers who could solve problems and rescue us and look after us, keep us safe. And that residual desire for something is a very powerful psychological impulse. This is where I think the idea of being an adult, being a grown-up intellectually, of taking responsibility, and of living with doubt and uncertainty, which of course is the great mindset of science and is powerfully productive, not knowing the answers always, but always being keen to be looking for them, not living by dogma, but by accepting and embracing the uncertainty that drives us forward. And which accepts that every time you come up with a good account of something or a discovery, that's going to open more doors to more doubts.
The God argument. Faith can be beautiful, but women and children in subordinated households in the Bible Belt of the U.S. may not see it as so.
When I was a graduate student at Oxford, I was friendly with a man who unbeknownst to me, had a wife and twin daughters in a flat in the married graduate housing complex that the university holds. And it was only some months into my acquaintanceship with him when I called round at his flat one day, his apartment, as you say there, to give him something that he'd left behind at a meeting. And the door was opened by a woman, and it turned out that she was his wife, and there were these children clinging to her skirt. And she wasn't, I discovered, allowed out of the flat unless she was in his company, and this was very rarely. I was shocked by it, and making inquiries and thinking about it, discovered that the parallels between women in Saudi Arabia, which of course they're much more extreme example of how women can be closeted away and denied access to the public sphere and only allowed to enter it if they're in company with a male relative. That of course is an extreme form of it in Saudi Arabia, but that to some extent this sometimes happens among people of very zealous commitment in the Bible Belt. And I think it's worth mentioning because it is a civil liberties issue, and it's an issue about the position of women in our societies.
And finally, Professor Grayling, I wanted to ask you about one other book that you've written, Among the Dead Cities. Was the bombing, the Allied bombing of Germany and Japan, moral?
I don't think it was. I was very intrigued, since when I was a very small boy, my great ambition was to be a Spitfire pilot in the Battle of Britain, which would have involved time travel, better eyesight, and my mother's permission, since I was only 5 at the time. I became very, very interested in the air war in the Second World War. And as I read more and more about it, so I came to recognize this equivocation always about the nature of the area bombing campaigns. This was the indiscriminate bombing of cities by night, not looking for individual militarily important targets, but just trying to demoralize the population and to hurt the population. And it seems to me that the Allied effort, especially the Western Allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, they had a great duty. The duty was to beat Nazism. Nazism was an evil thing, and it had to be defeated. But we must never allow ourselves to get away with thinking that because that was the overriding concern, everything else that we did was okay, that we can't inspect our own activities. And the idea of indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations, which we did night after night, week after week, month after month, year after year during the war, the great devastation of the civilian population of Germany, I think it does require investigation. The same with the atom bombing of Japan. And there I don't think we did ourselves any favours, and we have to learn the lesson from it. We've got to ask ourselves very hard questions. The ends don't justify every mean, and so we've got to be ready to confront our past and to make use of what we learn from it for the future.